Have you ever wondered why the same fire that forges genius often burns everyone around it to ashes? Here's something Carl Jung understood that most people refuse to accept. The narcissism we condemn in monsters is often identical to the narcissism we worship in geniuses. And no one embodied this paradox more perfectly than Pablo Picasso. Society celebrates him as the most influential artist of the 20th century, a revolutionary who changed how humanity sees itself. But the women who loved him tell a different story. A story of psychological destruction, of egos so inflated they collapsed into black holes, consuming everything nearby. By the end of this journey, you'll discover a disturbing truth about creative brilliance that Jung uncovered in his deepest work on the psyche. A truth that might force you to reconsider everything you believe about greatness, about art, and perhaps most uncomfortably, about yourself. Because what if the narcissism that creates masterpieces and the narcissism that destroys lives aren't just similar? What if they're the exact same psychological mechanism, simply pointed in different directions? Imagine a young boy in Malaga, Spain, born in 1881 with eyes that saw the world differently, not poetically different, psychologically different. Pablo Picasso didn't just paint what he saw, he consumed it, devoured it, and then recreated it in his own image. His first word wasn't mama or papa, it was piz, short for lapis, pencil. From the beginning, the tool of creation was his primary language. His father, José Ruiz Blasco, an art teacher and painter, recognized something terrifying in his son's talent. By age 13, Picasso had already surpassed his father's abilities, and his father did something extraordinary, something that reveals the magnitude of what he recognized. He gave his brushes and palette to his son and vowed never to paint again. This wasn't humility. This wasn't a gracious passing of the torch. This was surrender, recognition that something beyond normal human ambition had awakened in the boy, something so powerful that it eclipsed not just his father's talent, but his father's very identity as an artist. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. That recognition became fuel, not gratitude, not responsibility, fuel. Young Picasso didn't just want to be good, he needed to be godlike. He needed to prove that his father's surrender was justified, that he was worthy of that sacrifice. But more than that, he needed to prove he was beyond everyone. At 15, he passed the entrance exam to Barcelona's School of Fine Arts, completing in one day what should have taken a month. At 16, he was admitted to Madrid's Royal Academy of San Fernando, Spain's most prestigious art school. He lasted barely a year. Why? Not because he failed, because he found it beneath him. He had already decided that formal training was irrelevant, that his vision superseded centuries of accumulated artistic wisdom. He moved to Paris at 19, and the city became his laboratory not just for art but for power. He didn't study the masters to honor them, he studied them to destroy them, to prove his superiority over them, to remake art itself in his singular vision. He lived in squalor, in a dilapidated building nicknamed the Bateau Laveur, the laundry boat, with other struggling artists. But his poverty wasn't humbling him, it was concentrating him, distilling his ambition into something pure and almost frightening in its intensity. The blue period emerged from this time, paintings soaked in melancholy and isolation. But even in his depression, even in his poverty, the narcissism was building. Each painting was a declaration. I alone can see this suffering. I alone can render it. Then came the rose period, softer, warmer, but still fundamentally about his vision imposing itself on reality. And then, in 1907, came the earthquake. Les Demoiselles d'Avignon with that single painting. Picasso didn't just break the rules of art. He shattered the entire canvas of Western painting tradition and declared himself its new architect. He took African masks, Iberian sculpture, and Cézanne geometry, and he fused them into something the art world had never seen. 5 naked prostitutes staring directly at the viewer, their bodies fractured and reassembled according to Picasso's internal logic, not nature's. The painting was violent, it was aggressive, it was a psychological assault. The art world was horrified. Georges Braque, who would become his partner in developing Cubism, said it was like drinking gasoline and spitting fire. Even Picasso's closest friends thought he'd gone insane. But then something happened. The horror transformed into mesmerization, then into worship. Within a few years, Picasso wasn't just an artist, he was a movement, he was a revolution. And this is where Jung would have leaned forward in his chair, because this is where the psychology becomes fascinating. Picasso didn't just create revolutionary art, he created a gravitational field around himself so powerful that people, especially women, couldn't escape his orbit once they entered it. His charisma wasn't charm. It was force. People described being in his presence as overwhelming, like standing too close to a fire. His first serious love, Fernande Olivier, a beautiful model and aspiring artist herself, described him as possessive, jealous, paranoid. He would lock her in their apartment when he went out. He would interrogate her about where she'd been, who she'd spoken to, what they'd said. He monitored her friendships, her conversations, her very thoughts. He needed to own not just her body but her soul, her gaze, her very existence. But here's the twisted brilliance. He painted her with such intensity, such perceived devotion, that the world saw passion. The paintings showed a woman bathed in rose light, beautiful and serene. Only she felt the prison, only she knew that the intensity on the canvas was matched by an intensity of control in life. When she finally left him, she wrote in her memoir, Picasso's only interest in people was as they affected him or his work. She had been a muse, a model, an extension of his artistic will, never quite a person. Then came Olga Kubklova, the Russian ballerina who became his first wife in 1918. This is where Picasso's narcissism evolved, became more sophisticated. Olga represented everything Fernande wasn't: aristocratic lineage, connections to high society, respectability. Picasso pursued her like a military campaign. He courted her with the full force of his personality, his growing fame, his promises of a life transformed. She represented status, legitimacy, entry into the world of the European elite. He got what he wanted. They married. She bore him a son, Paolo, and then, slowly, methodically, systematically, he began to destroy her in his paintings. This is crucial to understand. As their marriage deteriorated, as Olga's initial enchantment gave way to the reality of living with a narcissist, Picasso's portraits of her became increasingly monstrous, distorted, grotesque. In the early years, she was elegant, poised, beautiful in his paintings. By the late 1920s, she was appearing as fragmented, screaming, deformed. He was painting his rage, his contempt, his need to dominate. But more than that, he was using his art as a weapon, publicly humiliating her through the very medium that had seduced her. Imagine seeing yourself portrayed as a monster in paintings exhibited around the world, knowing that critics and collectors were studying your deformed image, while your husband was celebrated as a genius for creating it. Art historians call it his metamorphosis period. Jung would call it something else: the shadow made visible, weaponized, and sold to the highest bidder. But Olga couldn't leave. She was trapped by social convention, by her son, by her own terror of scandal. So Picasso did what narcissists do when they can't escape a situation they've grown bored with. He created a parallel reality. Enter Marie Thérèse Walter. She was 17 years old when Picasso, 45 and married, approached her outside the Galeries Lafayette department store in Paris in 1927 and said, "I am Picasso. You and I are going to do great things together." She didn't know who Picasso was. She was a schoolgirl, an athlete, innocent in ways that Olga had never been. And that innocence was exactly what he needed. She became his secret mistress, his hidden muse, concealed from Olga for years. He rented an apartment for her near his studio. He painted her obsessively, but noticed the difference. Where Olga became monstrous in his work, Marie Thérèse appeared voluptuous, peaceful, dreamlike, submissive. He painted her sleeping, resting, always passive, always receptive. She was everything Olga wasn't. And that was precisely the point. He wasn't responding to who these women actually were. He was creating women on canvas to serve his psychic needs, arranging human beings like elements in his compositions, painting them according to his internal requirements, not their external reality. Marie Thérèse bore him a daughter, Maya, in 1935. The birth forced the affair into the open. Olga was devastated. She separated from Picasso but, under French law at the time, refused to divorce him because it would mean splitting his assets. So Picasso remained legally married to a woman he despised while living with his teenage mistress. But by this point, even Marie Thérèse wasn't enough. The narcissist's appetite is insatiable. Supply always diminishes. Novelty always fades. Then came Dora Maar in 1936, brilliant, artistic, politically engaged, photographer in her own right, volatile, intense. She was everything Marie Thérèse wasn't: intellectual, challenging, an artist herself. Picasso met her in a cafe where she was playing a knife game, stabbing between her fingers, cutting herself. He was transfixed. Here was a woman who matched his intensity, who could engage with him intellectually, who understood art. She documented the creation of Guernica, one of his masterpieces. She was his witness during the Spanish Civil War, during World War II, during some of his most politically and artistically significant work. But Picasso said something revealing about her for me. She was always the weeping woman, and indeed, his portraits of her show a woman in perpetual psychological anguish, face fractured across multiple planes, tears streaming, eyes wide with horror. Was he documenting her pain or creating it? Perhaps both. He kept both women, Marie Thérèse and Dora, in his life simultaneously, sometimes arranging for them to encounter each other, watching their distress as if it were performance art. Dora later said he enjoyed making them jealous of each other, that he orchestrated their suffering as carefully as he orchestrated his compositions. When Picasso eventually moved on to his next lover, Françoise Gillet, in 1943, Dora Maar suffered a complete nervous breakdown. She was hospitalized, received electroshock therapy, and spent years in psychoanalysis with Jacques Lacan himself. She would say later that Picasso had killed something essential in her. After her breakdown, she retreated from public life almost entirely. She stopped photographing seriously. She became reclusive, eventually turning to mysticism and Catholicism, trying to piece together a self that Picasso had systematically dismantled. She lived another 50 years after their relationship ended, but multiple biographers describe her as a ghost, someone whose essential vitality had been extracted and never returned. Francoise Gillet was different. She was also an artist, talented and ambitious. When Picasso met her, she was 21 and he was 61. She was young enough to be his granddaughter. But Francoise had something the others lacked: an analytical mind, a capacity for psychological observation, and ultimately, an instinct for self-preservation. She stayed with Picasso for 10 years. She bore him 2 children, Claude and Paloma. She watched him work. She studied him like a subject. And after a decade, she did something none of the others had done. She walked away. She took her children and left. And then, even more unforgivably from Picasso's perspective, she wrote a memoir, Life with Picasso, published in 1964. She told the truth. She documented his cruelty, his manipulation, his narcissism. Picasso was enraged. He tried to have the book banned. He cut off contact with their children. He told everyone who would listen that Francoise was a liar, ungrateful, a traitor. He said, "No woman leaves a man like me," but she had. And her departure, her refusal to be consumed, revealed something crucial about Picasso's power. It wasn't absolute. It required participation, submission, a willingness to be consumed. Francoise's refusal exposed the mechanism. She showed that his gravitational field could be escaped, that his reality wasn't the only reality, that his vision of who she was didn't have to define her. But even in his final years, even after Francoise, even with Jacqueline Roque, his last wife whom he married in 1961 at age 80, the pattern continued. Jacqueline was devoted to the point of self-annihilation. She organized her entire existence around his needs. She controlled access to him, managed his household, essentially became the high priestess of the Picasso cult. When he died in 1973, she was so protective of his legacy that she forbade his children from previous relationships from attending his funeral. Paulo, his son with Olga, was turned away. Claude and Paloma, his children with Francoise, were barred. She had become not just Picasso's wife but the guardian of his myth, willing to sacrifice anything, including relationships with his own children, to protect the image. And then, in 1986, 13 years after Picasso's death, Jacqueline shot herself. She was 59 years old. Various biographers speculate about her motives, but one pattern emerges. She couldn't exist outside the force field of his presence. Even in death, even after more than a decade, she remained in orbit around him. And when she finally couldn't sustain it, she chose oblivion. Here's what Jung understood that makes this story so psychologically profound, so deeply relevant to understanding human nature. Picasso wasn't an anomaly. He wasn't a unique monster who happened to be a genius. He was an archetype made flesh. Jung called it the pure etinus merged with radical inflation of the ego. The pure etinus, the eternal boy, is the archetype of perpetual youth, of refusal to mature, of demanding that the world accommodate one's desires rather than adapting oneself to reality. It's Peter Pan psychology. But when the pure is combined with genuine creative power and societal validation, it becomes dangerous. More specifically, Picasso embodied what Jung termed creative narcissism, where the psyche's drive for self-expression becomes so overwhelming, so all-consuming, that other human beings cease to exist as separate entities. They become raw material, pigment tools for the artist's vision. Jung wrote extensively about the artist's psychology in his essays on literature, art, and the creative process. He observed that great creative genius often stems from a powerful connection to the collective unconscious, to the archetypal realm that exists beneath personal experience. The artist, at their best, serves as a conduit for these deeper forces, bringing them into form for the collective to experience. But here's the danger Jung identified. When the ego identifies with that creative power, when the person confuses themselves with the archetype they channel, when they believe they are the source of the power rather than its vessel, something catastrophic happens psychologically. The ego inflates. It expands beyond its natural boundaries. It begins to believe it is special, chosen, beyond normal human limitations and moral considerations. And once that inflation occurs, the person develops what Jung called a mana personality, an inflated sense of almost magical power over others, a belief that normal rules don't apply because one has access to special knowledge or special abilities. Picasso exhibited every symptom of mana personality inflation. He believed his vision was superior to reality itself. He famously said, "I don't seek, I find." Think about that statement. It's not the humility of an artist grateful for inspiration. It's the arrogance of someone who believes reality rearranges itself at their command. There was no humility in his process, no doubt, no questioning. He had become, in his own mind, not an artist but a force of nature. And like a force of nature, a hurricane or an earthquake, he felt no guilt about the destruction he caused. Hurricanes don't apologize. Volcanoes don't feel remorse. Neither did Picasso. But Jung identified something even more insidious in this type of narcissism, something that goes beyond simple egotism. He called it psychic vampirism, though not in any supernatural sense. The narcissistically inflated artist doesn't just use people instrumentally for practical purposes. They feed on psychic energy, on vitality, on the very sense of self that others possess. They need witnesses, admirers, victims to confirm their grandiosity moment by moment. Without that constant supply of psychic fuel from others, without that continuous validation and mirroring, the inflated ego collapses back into the wound it's covering, which is often a profound sense of emptiness or inadequacy. Look at how Picasso organized his life. He needed to be surrounded by people constantly, but on his terms, in his space, following his rhythms, playing roles he assigned. His studios were temples, where he was the god, and everyone else was either worshipper or sacrifice. Women, friends, dealers, other artists, they all had to adapt completely to his reality. He painted through the night, slept during the day, ate when he felt like it, demanded absolute availability from everyone in his circle. Anyone who couldn't sustain that rhythm, who had needs of their own, who asserted their own reality, was discarded. Not out of malice necessarily, but out of necessity. They had ceased to function as fuel. They had become useless to the machine of his ego. Now here's where Jung introduces a second concept that illuminates Picasso's psychology even more deeply: the principle of enantiodromia. This is one of Jung's most profound insights. Borrowed from Heraclitus, it's the idea that everything eventually transforms into its opposite when taken to an extreme. Day becomes night, summer becomes winter, and psychological qualities, when pushed far enough, flip into their shadows. The very trait that made Picasso a genius, his absolute, uncompromising vision, his narcissistic belief in his own perception above all others, his refusal to be constrained by convention or by others' needs, was the exact same trait that made him a monster in relationships. The fire that created masterpieces incinerated human beings. They weren't two different qualities existing side by side. They were one quality manifesting in different contexts. His inability to see others as separate, autonomous beings with their own equal reality was precisely what allowed him to see through conventional visual representation, to fracture and reconstruct the human figure according to his own logic. His emotional coldness, his capacity to disconnect from others' suffering, was what allowed him to pursue his vision with single-minded intensity for 8 decades. The narcissism and the genius weren't in conflict. They were unified, two sides of the same psychological coin. Jung would say that Picasso had failed to integrate his shadow. The shadow, in Jungian psychology, contains everything we refuse to acknowledge about ourselves, everything that contradicts our ego identity. For most people, the shadow contains the rejected dark parts, the selfishness, the cruelty, the lust for power, the capacity for violence. But for someone like Picasso, someone whose ego was built entirely around creative power and narcissistic self-assertion, the shadow contained something else, something most people wouldn't expect. It contained the capacity for genuine empathy, for seeing others as equally real, equally valuable, equally deserving of their own perspective. He had rejected those qualities, pushed them into the unconscious, because they would have interfered with his artistic vision. To truly see another person, to truly feel their separateness, their autonomy, their right to exist on their own terms, would have weakened the narcissistic intensity that fueled his work. It would have introduced doubt, hesitation, consideration of others' needs, and for Picasso that was unacceptable. His art required absolute certainty, absolute conviction, absolute prioritization of his vision above all else. So the empathic parts of his psyche, the relational parts, the parts that could have loved others as real beings rather than as muses or mirrors, remained forever in shadow, forever rejected, forever projected onto others as weakness. This is the disturbing part, the part that makes this story so uncomfortable. Picasso's genius may have actually required his monstrosity, not because evil creates beauty in some romantic sense, but because the same psychic structure that enabled him to remake visual reality, to impose his vision so totally onto canvas, prevented him from granting others their own reality. He could only create by consuming. He could only make art by making others into art. And Jung understood this paradox existed not just in Picasso but throughout history in many creative titans, many leaders, many people who changed the world. The gifts and the wounds, the genius and the shadow, often spring from the same source. But here's what's even more unsettling, what Jung would want us to understand. These same dynamics exist in all of us in smaller, more socially acceptable doses. The narcissistic impulse, the desire to remake the world in our image, the tendency to use others unconsciously to fulfill our vision, the moments when we prioritize our narrative over someone else's autonomy. These aren't aberrations, they're human, they're part of the structure of ego consciousness itself. Picasso simply had access to a larger canvas, both literal and metaphorical. His narcissism had the power and the platform to create Guernica, perhaps the most powerful anti-war painting ever made, a work that genuinely expanded human consciousness about violence and suffering. But it also had the power to shatter Dora Ma's mind, to leave Meretheres emotionally dependent until her own suicide decades later, to alienate his own children. So what do we do with this knowledge? How do we hold both truths simultaneously? That Picasso gave humanity invaluable gifts of vision and innovation, that he permanently expanded the vocabulary of visual art, and that he destroyed the women who loved him. Jung would say this is precisely the psychological work we must do in our era, not to excuse, not to simply condemn, but to understand the architecture of the psyche that produces such extremes, to understand that genius and shadow aren't separate, that greatness and destruction can flow from the same source, that the human psyche is complex enough to contain profound gifts and profound wounds simultaneously. The danger for us isn't that we'll become Picasso. Most of us will never have his talent or his platform or his societal permission to behave as he behaved. The danger is that we'll fail to recognize the Picasso patterns in ourselves at smaller scales. The moments when we prioritize our vision over someone else's reality. The times when we subtly, unconsciously treat people as supporting characters in our narrative rather than as protagonists of their own stories. The ways we feed our egos on others' admiration, validation, sacrifice. The relationships where we're the artist and they're the medium, even if we'd never describe it that way. Jung developed a concept called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming conscious of our unconscious patterns, integrating our shadow, and developing into a more complete, more balanced human being. For someone like Picasso, true individuation would have required recognizing that his artistic power came with a psychological cost to others, and then making a conscious choice about how to wield that power. It would have required him to see the women in his life as fully real, not as muses or mothers or mirrors or material, but as separate autonomous beings with their own psychic integrity, their own equal importance, their own right to exist on their own terms. He never did that work. He couldn't, or wouldn't, pay that price. His art was more important to him than any human relationship, and society rewarded him for that choice with fame, wealth, immortality. But we can make different choices. We can do the work he refused. Here's your workshop, your moment of uncomfortable self-inquiry. This is where we move from understanding Picasso to understanding ourselves, because that's the only point of studying others, to illuminate our own shadows. First, identify your canvas. What is the vision, the project, the dream that you're pursuing with such intensity that you might be unconsciously using others to achieve it? It doesn't have to be art. It could be a career, a business, a personal transformation, a fitness goal, even a relationship where you're trying to create the perfect partnership according to your script. Where in your life are you acting as the artist and treating others as your medium? Where do you get frustrated when people don't fit into your vision? Where do you feel entitled to others' time, energy, or adaptation to your needs? This requires brutal honesty. The ego will resist this inquiry because it threatens the story you tell yourself about being a good person. Second, recognize your muses. Who are the people in your life that you've unconsciously assigned roles to? Who exists primarily to support your vision, to validate your choices, to witness your growth, to make you feel good about yourself? This is subtle, we all do it. Parents do it with children, partners do it with each other, managers do it with employees, friends do it within their groups. We're constantly casting people in our internal dramas, assigning them roles based on our needs rather than seeing who they actually are. The question isn't whether you have these patterns, because you do, everyone does. The question is whether you're conscious of them, because unconscious use of others is where narcissism thrives, where shadow patterns control us. Conscious choice about interdependence, conscious negotiation of mutual needs, is where ethical relationship begins. Third, and this is perhaps the hardest, confront your enantiodromia. What quality do you most pride yourself on? What do you consider your greatest strength, your independence, your vision, your strength, your sensitivity, your intelligence, your empathy, your creativity, your discipline? Now ask, how might this exact quality, taken to its extreme or applied unconsciously, become its opposite? How might your independence become isolation or inability to truly connect? Your vision become blindness to others' needs or realities? Your strength become domination or inability to be vulnerable? Your sensitivity become manipulation or emotional tyranny? Your intelligence become arrogance or disconnection from feeling? Your empathy become enmeshment or loss of boundaries? Your creativity become narcissism or exploitation? Your discipline become rigidity or control of others? This is shadow work. This is where Jung separates the people who genuinely want to grow, who genuinely want to become more conscious, from those who just want to feel good about themselves. Shadow work is uncomfortable. It requires you to look at how your strengths create your weaknesses. It requires you to see how the very qualities you're proud of may be harming others when you're not paying attention. It requires humility, which is the opposite of ego inflation. Fourth, and this is crucial, practice what Jung called active imagination with the people in your life. This means genuinely imagining their inner world, their perspective, their experience of you, not what you want their experience to be, but what it actually might be. If you're in conflict with someone, genuinely try to inhabit their perspective, not to agree with them necessarily, but to understand that from inside their experience, they're the protagonist and you might be the antagonist. Picasso never did this. He never genuinely wondered what it felt like to be Olga watching herself transform into a monster in his paintings. He never genuinely felt Maratheri's confusion as a teenager being pursued by a married man in his 40s. He never truly imagined Dora's breakdown from the inside. He remained locked in his own perspective because that's what his art required. But you're not Picasso. Your vision, whatever it is, doesn't require you to sacrifice others. And if you think it does, if you've convinced yourself that your goals are so important that others should accommodate you, that's the ego inflation talking. That's the mana personality emerging. That's the shadow operating. Fifth, create what Jung would call an ethical container for your power. This means consciously deciding how you'll use whatever gifts you have. If you're talented, charismatic, creative, intelligent, ambitious, any quality that gives you power over or influence with others, you need to consciously decide how you'll wield it. Will you use it for mutual benefit or primarily for yourself? Will you respect others' autonomy or expect them to adapt to you? Will you see people as ends in themselves or means to your ends? These aren't abstract philosophical questions. They're daily practical choices. Picasso had enormous power, enormous talent, enormous influence, and he used it purely for himself. He created an ethical wasteland around his genius. You don't have to repeat that pattern. Picasso never did this work. He died at 91, having lived exactly as he wanted, having created exactly as he wanted, having treated people exactly as he wanted, regardless of the human cost. And maybe, in some terrible sense, he was right for himself. Maybe his art required that level of narcissism, that complete disregard for others. Maybe we wouldn't have Cubism, wouldn't have Guernica, wouldn't have 20,000 works of art that changed human consciousness if he'd been a kinder, more empathic person. Maybe the price of his genius was other people's suffering, and society decided that was an acceptable trade. But you can decide differently for yourself, because here's what Jung ultimately believed. Consciousness is a moral act. Becoming aware of your shadow, your patterns, your impact on others. That awareness itself creates responsibility. Once you see how you use others, you can't unsee it. Once you understand your narcissistic patterns, you have to choose whether to continue them. Ignorance might be an excuse, but consciousness never is. Picasso's story serves as a warning. Genius without consciousness is ultimately destructive. Power without empathy is ultimately monstrous. Talent without ethics is ultimately narcissistic. And the line between visionary and vampire, between genius and monster, is thinner than we'd like to believe. It's not that artists or creative people or ambitious people are inherently narcissistic. It's that the same intensity, the same vision, the same refusal to accept limitations that produces great work can also produce great harm if it's not balanced by consciousness, by shadow work, by genuine ethical consideration of others. If you've stayed with me through this uncomfortable journey, through this exploration of one of the 20th century's most celebrated and most destructive figures, you're already doing something Picasso never did. Questioning, examining, willing to look at the shadow side of greatness, willing to confront the uncomfortable truth that gifts and wounds often share the same root. That's the beginning of true psychological work. That's the path Jung mapped out for anyone brave enough to walk it. It's not an easy path. It requires looking at parts of yourself you'd prefer to ignore. It requires giving up the ego inflation that makes you feel special. It requires granting others the same reality you grant yourself. Subscribe to continue this journey into the depths of the psyche, because the most important art you'll ever create isn't on a canvas. It's not in a gallery. It's not something critics will review or collectors will buy. It's the conscious, ethical, integrated self you're building every single day, in every interaction, in every choice about how you treat the people around you. And unlike Picasso's paintings, that masterpiece doesn't require you to destroy anyone else to complete it. The real genius, the genius Jung spent his life trying to cultivate in people, isn't in consuming others to fuel your fire. It's in learning to burn bright while helping others find their own light. It's in recognizing that your vision is just one vision among billions, not the only vision. It's in creating without destroying. It's in achieving without dominating. It's in becoming great without becoming monstrous. That's the work, that's the journey, and it starts now, with this moment of uncomfortable self-recognition. Welcome to the real art of living.